nuovamente Rita Horvath, che si è prestata, devo dire la verità, a presentare le linee guida tedesche, perché sono in realtà le uniche linee guida che a livello europeo sono pubblicate a livello dello Stato, diciamo, dovrebbero essere eseguite a livello statale. E poi aggiungerò io qualche parolina sullo stato delle linee guida, che invece in Italia sono completamente assenti. Doveva venire Cornelia Brown, ma non è potuta venire, quindi. Rita Horvath, ricordo, è il coordinatore dell'ERN neuromuscolare sottogruppo mitocondriale. Grazie, Rita.
Thank you very much. And I would like to tell that it's not my presentation, it's Cornelia Kornblum's presentation.
I told in Italian.
Okay. Who presented the development of the German guidelines for mitochondrial diseases at the meeting in November 2018 in Prague. And then she could not come, and I am trying to present her talk, but I may miss some of the points, but it may be still interesting for you. So why do we need guidelines? So in the clinical practice, it's impossible to keep track on everything what is new and read all the papers which is coming up in these rare diseases. Therefore, it's very important to have some papers which are summarizing the best clinical practice and provide some guidelines. And Cornelia has been involved in making the German guidelines for mitochondrial diseases for many, many years, and this is just her feeling about it, how she feels about this process, although she acknowledges that it's important. So it is just a summary what type of guidelines are published or were present so far for mitochondrial diseases. So in 2009 there was an EFNS guideline, but for now it's out of date, so we need new guidelines. There were some very important workshops which were aiming to develop guidelines for certain groups of mitochondrial diseases and also for developing outcome measures, but like the one that I mentioned, it was also supported by the Mitocon it was a bit more than 2 years ago in Rome. And there are smaller groups who develop their own guidelines, and it's not very small, but in Newcastle, the Newcastle Wellcome Center for Mitochondrial Disease developed some own guidelines which are on the homepage, and this is based on the expertise of the people who work in the center. And there was a workshop on stroke-like episodes in March 2018 in Newcastle, where several experts who see patients with stroke-like episodes were invited, and it was based on the Delphi method. And this, the result of this workshop is also in progress, and it hopefully will be published soon. There are also other guidelines aiming just very special small groups of this mitochondrial disease, like Wolfram syndrome, or guidelines from the Barcelona group. And there were also some other important workshops and papers which are not guidelines, but they can be used to develop guidelines for mitochondrial disease. And that's the German guidelines, which had a very long history, and it has to be reviewed and renewed this year. The Americans are also quite active in developing guidelines. So they published papers for the practice patterns of mitochondrial disease physicians in North America, part 1 on the diagnostic and clinical challenges, and also on treatment and management. And there was a previous systematic review paper what the Mitochondrial Medicine Society published a few years ago, and also a couple of years ago large paper involving several co-authors, many from the US and a few from Europe, participated in developing this standards of care paper. But it is still the opinion of the people who are involved, and some groups think differently in some of the aspects, so it's not internationally accepted for all aspects. And the US Mitochondrial Medicine Society also was very active in developing mitochondrial care networks, and they are interested in joining the European mitochondrial centers, and we are looking into some more collaboration with them. Now back to the German guidelines. So this initiative started to develop guidelines in neurological diseases, started 28 years ago. Professor Diener proposed this for the German Neurology Society for Neurology, and they developed the first 27 guidelines until 2001. And after 2001, now they started to develop under other 116 guidelines about different neurological conditions, and it is a huge process involving over 1,000 authors. And originally it was published in a book format, but now the recent guidelines are published online. And they are having regular updates in about 3 to 5 years. And usually the guidelines should be based on the Delphi method. More of the speakers mentioned already in the presentation. So the Delphi method is as a structured communication technique or method, originally developed as a systematic interactive forecasting method which relies on a panel of experts. And usually some organizers of this panel make some questionnaires. These questionnaires are sent around to the members of the panel. Everybody answers the question, and then at the meeting first they review the answers, and if there is consensus in some aspects, then they accept it, but there are usually aspects which there is no consensus enough among the people, and they have to be discussed and reviewed, and they have a few rounds until they accept the consensus. So there are different stages of development for the guidelines. There is a S1 guideline in Germany. It's an informal consensus worked out by an expert group, and the German mitochondrial disease guidelines will remain probably at this level. And the higher levels are formal consensus finding process, consensus-based and systematic research for evidence, and so they are much higher stages, but it is so difficult to develop those that the mitochondrial guidelines will not reach that level. So it's also, there's a system which is reviewing how good the guidelines were made. So it's a control system for evaluating the guidelines in Germany. And there is also a level of evidence is classified, and the highest level of evidence, if it's based on a meta-analysis of more than 3 randomized control trials. The next stage is if it's the evidence is according to more than or at least 1 randomized control trial, or a meta-analysis of less than 3 randomized control trials. So there is a different evidence base for the guidelines as well. And also, after all this grading, they also give a degree of recommendation of the guidelines. And the grade 1 is at least 1 or more randomized control trial is supporting it. It's a good quality and consistency, directly referring to the recommendation. And then the others are always a bit less stringent. What is important to know that these guidelines are not legally binding, because nobody can take on legal responsibility of producing guidelines which may result in legal issues later on. So always the physicians themselves are responsible for their treatment decisions, not the guideline. So this is the home page where the German neurology guidelines are based, and how the process is happening. So first, there is a panel of experts has to be put together, and the coordinator has to call together the panel of experts who will work on the guidelines. For the German Neurological Society, the guidelines are developed for Germany, Switzerland and Austria, and they are in German language. And so most of the panel members are from Germany, but from the other countries, from Austria and Switzerland, they are nominated members who are nominated by their own countries. And there should be adult clinicians, pediatric clinicians, and other specialists who are involved in the treatment of these patients. And then the coordinator is invited by the German Society of Neurology, and the coordinator is also responsible for the reviewing, updating, and further developing the guidelines. So Cornelia has this role also, and she has to do quite a lot of work on this. And the next step, which is causing a lot of problems, that each member of the expert panel has to declare his or her interest for the competing interest. And in the panel, less than 50% of the panel members are allowed to have conflict of interest, and as you know, many of the people who are treating patients are involved in clinical trials with companies, so this is something what is restricting the people who can be involved in making the guidelines, and it resulted in a delay of, I think, 2 years almost with starting the review of the German guidelines. So if there is a panel of experts fixed, they had the declaration of conflict of interest, then they start to work, and they usually, in Germany, they try to use an online platform, which is specially designed for this process of developing medical guidelines. And all the panel members have to register online for this, and this is how it looks like. So if there is a consensus within an expert panel, then they have to produce a draft of the guideline, which has to be submitted to the German Society of Neurology, and then it will be reviewed by a committee, and they may suggest major or minor revision, and then it has to be revised and published online. Then it was just Cornelia had a lot of trouble with collecting the conflict of interest forms, and that was the reason why the formal process of the review could not have been started for 2 years. And this is how the structure looks like for the German mitochondrial guidelines. There's an introduction, first definition and classification of the diseases, diagnostic methods, general diagnostic methods in suspected mitochondrial disease, the recommended investigations, treatment options, and then there is a description for each larger mitochondrial disease group, and with specific recommendations there. And then how the expert panels look like. So there is a coordinator, it's a neurologist who is nominated by the German Society for Neurology. And there are 4 further neurologists nominated by the German Society for Neurology, and then there is 1 biochemist, 1 neuropediatrician from Germany, and then 1 neuropediatrician from Austria, 1 neurologist from Switzerland, and patient representatives are also. Yes. And that caused so much trouble that putting this together after all this, to follow all these regulations, that even the person who started to develop this guideline, he enough from how complicated this process becomes. And there are also some review papers on it that we have to review the process because otherwise it won't be applicable and won't be practicable. And that was only the situation for Germany, but the situation can be different in the different countries, and therefore it is very difficult to make guidelines for Europe in general within the ERN or within the European Association for Neurology. And therefore I have a feeling that maybe it's better to develop for certain important issues like what you have done with the harmful medications or for the emergency situations in mitochondrial disease, because they are still groups which can be still easier put together and provide exact help for the practical help for the clinicians, because making this whole for the whole groups of mitochondrial diseases and even potentially making it internationally available is very, very difficult. And that was what I wanted to say, and I would like to give it forward to